Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome back to our discussion of Ghamidi Saab, Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, and his counter-narrative with regard to religion and the state. His counter-narrative to the traditional narrative that has existed on what this relationship between Islam and the state should be. Up to this point, in the last few sessions, we've been discussing the content of the counter-narrative, primarily using the discussions that Ghamidi had in 2015 on this topic in relation to an article he wrote in the newspaper in Pakistan that was translated into English but came out in his words in Urdu, that looked and went through 10 points of this counter-narrative, critiquing some of the key ideas that the traditional narrative puts forward with regard to the relationship between religion and the state. And up to this point, we've discussed the first point, the second point, and had started on to the third point. And we're going to use this session to kind of wrap up some of the ideas on the third point, emphasize some of the key ideas there, while also starting our discussion into the fourth point, which we will go into in more detail in the next session. Okay, so with regard to the third point in Ghamidi's counter-narrative is critiquing the idea that Islam is a nationality, right? That you cannot have any other individual nationalities, really. Islam has to be your nationality, right? This notion of Islam being a nationality in some respects builds off of really the idea that we discussed as part of the second point, which gets put out there, which is that we have to, that it's a religious directive to work towards establishing a caliphate, a khilafah. And what Ghamidi says is, no, that is not a religious directive. That in fact, there's no basis for that in religion, that nothing in the Quran, nothing in the Sunnah is telling you that that's a religious directive. It might be something good, maybe something that you would like to do, maybe that you think that strategically it's a smart thing to do. Those are all separate things. So it doesn't mean that you can't pursue that. Certainly you can pursue that. But to say that it is a requirement of the faith is a different idea. That notion of establishing a global caliphate, at its core is the idea of Muslim unity, right? The search for this unity. And so it makes sense that building off of that, there would be a notion that, hey, we don't need any individual nationalities, that Islam has to be our nationality. And similarly here, Ghamidi says, no, actually there is no basis in religion to require that. Right? That this is not a religious directive. We are not directed in the faith to say that Islam is our only nationality. And we talked in the last session of how this has emerged as part of the discourse here in the United States as well for a long time, sort of a building off of a lot of the foundational ideas in political Islam around this kind of unity that's necessary and this response to the idea of nationalism and kind of the plague of nationalism that's often bemoaned in many Muslim communities, that this nationalism is keeping us separate, keeping us disunited, and that we need unity. And what Ghamidi would say is like, certainly, you can make that claim. You can say that, hey, we should give emphasis to our Muslim identity over all these other identities. Okay. But to say that you are religiously required to do that you are obligated to do that, to get rid of all your other identifying markers and only identify as Muslim, that this is actually not a requirement of the faith. And if you were to make it a requirement of faith, there are many consequences that come with that, which certainly Islam does not require. But he talks about the fact that this emerged as a major point of debate in the subcontinent, in India, between a major figure in Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani and Allama Iqbal, the famous thinker and poet. And Madani, the religious scholar here, said, look, like we can be Indian nationals. We can be people who exist in the territory of India and identify as Indian nationals and still be Muslim. And for Iqbal, this was what he felt to be the death knell of religion. That if you would allow that, if you would allow this type of national identity based on territory, that it would essentially undercut religion completely. So he attacked it and critiqued it severely and harshly. And the power of his pen, persuasiveness of his voice, ended up giving life to this idea in many circles where it didn't exist before either, right? And this was a time where, again, contextually, you're dealing with a real grappling with what it means to be a Muslim in the world, what it means to exist in a world where the caliphate has now, even the symbolic caliphate has essentially ended, and what that means for the Muslim future. And the prospect of national identity for many people, and Iqbal, I would say, included, this is sort of my own intervention here, the prospect of national identity felt like a looming threat to the continued persistence of Muslim as an identity marker, a unifying marker for a community. Okay, so with all that in mind, what Ghamidi raises then are a number of questions, right? Which he is then obviously going to give answers to, right? He said, look, the question arises for us as Muslims as to whether we can accept national identity based on territory, right? If you are saying we can't do it in India, Iqbal, right? Then we certainly cannot do it in America. We can't do it in England, or frankly, any other Arab country. Because once we say that the basis of national identity is Islam, that Muslims are a people as well as being a religious community, that then means that they cannot identify with any other form of nationality, right? This idea that Muslims are a people, right? Not simply a religion, but a people. This idea that's still expressed today, that in Ghamdi's view negates the possibility of all those other forms of nationality or identity, right? There are millions of Muslims currently identifying as Indian or American or some other territorially based identity. And so the subsequent question that comes up is, by doing so then, are they participating in a form of kufr, right? In a form of disbelief, right? In a form of rejection of religion. By identifying as one of these other national identities, Indian, American, British, whatever else, are you essentially rejecting religion, right? Are you performing kufr? If your nationality can only be Islam, and Ghamidi says it's really not possible for you to say that you also have a nationality as an American, as an Afghani, or whatever else. Okay, so with that in mind, how do we address this? What's kind of the path forward from our current reality? One path, or one argument that gets put forward is that, well, look, European colonialism made all these divisions that exist in the Muslim world today, that are divisions among us, right? And that, in fact, in order to really rectify the situation, we need to work towards a global caliphate for Muslims, which will be both our system and our identity, right? That European colonialism did harm, did damage, did destruction to Muslim identity by creating and emphasizing all these national identities based around territory and borders, and that what we need to do in order to fix the state of affairs is to establish this global caliphate. And some will claim that this is what Islam wants and requires, that there should be a global nation for Muslims. Right? But it's one thing to argue that this global caliphate is the ideal. And the current situation is not ideal, but it's also just not wrong, right? Okay, so there are many people who might say that. They might say, hey, look, the ideal thing would be for us to be in a global caliphate. But At the current moment, it's not possible, right? The current situation is not ideal, this situation of Muslim states, etc. But it's also not wrong, right? It's not the best, it's not the ideal, but it's not haram, right? It doesn't lead you to kufr. These positions could be reconciled, Ghamidi Sahib says. But if you're going to say that the nationality within Islam is Islam itself, then it goes beyond saying that, hey, this is an ideal that we need to seek, right? That it goes beyond saying, look, a global caliphate and a space where, yes, we are all identified just as Muslims, that we get rid of all the other nationalities and that we are just Muslim, that's the ideal. It goes beyond saying that. If you say that within the religion of Islam, the nationality is Islam, you are essentially saying it is un-Islamic to have national identities the way we have them today, right? What Ghamidi is pointing out is this distinction. For some it might be subtle, but it's quite serious, right? It's quite serious to say that the global caliphate is not simply an ideal that we aspire to, it is a requirement, a tenet of the faith. Because when you say that it is a requirement of the faith, when you say that nationality in Islam, that not only is the caliphate a tenet of faith, but whatever political entity you exist in, your nationality is Islam, you're saying that any other identities, national identities, are essentially un-Islamic. And this position would basically say, look, the current state of affairs have been forced upon Muslims, but we are required to get out of it as soon as possible. Because we are essentially living in a state of sin until we do. Ghamdi's view is that this entire idea that nationality in Islam is Islam itself, is at its foundational level completely and utterly baseless. The notion that Islam is not simply my religion, but my nationality is fundamentally incorrect in Ghamdi's view. Right? He recognizes it has been deeply influential, given that people like Iqbal have advocated for it. Given that there's an entire history of the caliphate that inspires Muslims today towards this ideal. But Ghamidi again returns to this key principle in his thinking, in his methodology. And he argues that in order to make the claim that the basis of nationality is Islam, according to the faith, you have to do so from Islamic sources. That you cannot claim that the basis of nationality in Islam is the religion itself without pointing to proof from either the Word of God, prophetic tradition. When Ghamidi says it is baseless to make this claim, that nationality in Islam has to be Islam itself, he means that there is simply nothing in the Islamic sources to suggest this at all. There's absolutely no religious foundation for this. The idea, moreover, might be conceptually attractive, but what he says is when taken to the point, its logical endpoint, to the point of implementation, oftentimes by force, then this very idea produces what we see with Daesh or ISIS and other groups. Right? Because what they are doing is saying this is a religious obligation, that we need to have, that Islam has to be our nationality, there can't be any others, and we have to establish this caliphate. We have to do it by force if we need to, violence if we need to. He addresses then also the idea that the creation of Pakistan, was it due to a religious command? He said, no, that actually wasn't the case. There was a political demand there in that creation of Pakistan, but not a religious command. Quaid-e-Azam saw Hindu majority rule as potentially being detrimental to the Muslim population and determined that some other route was necessary to protect the community. And initially, a structure was sought within the Indian context to kind of insulate the Muslim population from the potential for Hindu supremacy. But this proved to be unsuccessful. And so the alternative became separation as a political objective, right? Separation on the basis of religious identity, right? If we make the argument, Ghamidi says, that we treat the creation of Pakistan as one that is based on Islam as a nationality, then in actuality, it's not even possible to call oneself Pakistani. That nationality cannot exist if the nationality of Islam is Islam, and that this motivated the creation of Pakistan, right, as a religious directive, because Muslims have to have that nationality of Islam, then Pakistan itself, it can't be an identity. Furthermore, you cannot really have a non-Muslim within that context claiming any identity as well as a Pakistani, right? Furthermore, if the state is created on the basis of a republic, national identity, that fundamentally cannot have distinction between its citizens. A republic, within its definition, requires equal citizenship, according to Ghamidi. But if it is based on an Islamic nationality, right, then your borders need to be open to all other Muslims. Your objective must be, in fact, to expand beyond simply the borders of this area called Pakistan to include all these other areas. That Muslim nationality is far more expansive by definition. And he actually outlines all these points, interestingly enough, as part of a letter that Iqbal's own son wrote to him, Javed Iqbal. Wrote to Iqbal well after his death, asking his father. Iqbal's son asked his father these questions, right? That these questions of contradiction, these challenges that occur when you begin to conceptualize a notion that the nationality of Islam is Islam itself, and this is a religious directive. So the idea, now going back, that you have to change your name when you become a Muslim, or adopt a different type of dress when you become a Muslim, or change your nationality, all of this, if you want to make an argument that this is required religiously, you have to do so from religious sources. Where's the proof for this, Ghamidi says? And he says, it just doesn't exist. And no proof is ever offered. In fact, he argues that this claim of Islam as nationality was something that was proclaimed by all or many, but actually not really acted upon. They would say it, but not really act upon it. The followers of Maududi and Iqbal did not actually identify their nationality as Islam and refuse all other nationalities. If this was truly a religious issue the way that it was articulated, then surely they would have taken steps to reject Pakistani identity or to reject taking any other identity as American or anything else. Well, some might say, Ghamidi says, that, well, in fact, sure, like maybe they didn't do that. This is a directive in religion, but in religion there are major directives and minor directives, and this is a minor directive that should be followed, but simply isn't. And that's not a big deal. But Ghamidi says this doesn't make sense. The notion that Islam is a Muslim's nationality is a foundational idea. It's a major idea. It cannot simply be ignored. It requires that all other markers of national identity be removed. It might be a fact that one is from a particular ethnic community or residing in a specific territory, but this idea, Islam is a Muslim's nationality, says that all those facts cannot become the basis of national identity. This is so foundational, he says, this idea, that you would expect it to be present in major places where the pillars of Islam are discussed. He brings up the example of the hadith of Jibreel, where he's of Jibril, he asked the Prophet, peace be upon him, what is Islam? And Ghamidi Sahib says, at that point, we should have had this there. This is that foundational. And it's not present, he says, because it's simply baseless. In the Quran, it has neither been said that Muslims are one nation, nor that Muslims should form one single nation. All that it has been said, according to Ghamidi, is that Muslims are brothers to each other. Meaning that regardless of what their race is, or their country is, or whatever identity of belonging they have, they are still my brother in faith, based on faith. That in fact, in Islam, Ghamidi says, we have not been made a single nation, but a single brotherhood. And what does that mean? It means that with regard to your brother, even in that kind of metaphorical way, right? That you are informed of their condition, that you concern yourself with their circumstances, that you are there for them in times of trouble, that you build these bonds of kinship where you might even give them preference in economic and social ties, right? That there is something about whatever that happens in their life that troubles them, that troubles you as well. That's what brotherhood means. But there's a difference between saying that we have to be a single nation and saying that we are a brotherhood. There's also a difference, he says, between saying that we want to create a Muslim nation or a united nation of Muslims as a political goal. He says that's fine. You can make a series of reasoned arguments as to why this should be the case, right? That it is a benefit to Muslims to be one nation, that it will make them more powerful, that you can say all of that. But what you cannot say, he says, is that it is a religious directive, because there is simply no support for this claim, right? And again, we go back to this idea that to give something the status of religion means giving it sacred status, means elevating it to a point where rejecting that becomes a serious transgression. So what Ghamidi is revolving around is this basic idea. She might not articulate specifically, but what he's trying to say is, look, religious difference can exist. We can have different opinions on things, different understandings of things, right? Without it being a point of sacredness where we are suddenly going against a religious directive, right? That we have to be very careful as to what we apply the stamp of religion upon, because the consequences are too severe for us to ignore. And for him, in the case of Islam as a nationality, that the religion of Islam requires us to all identify with the national identity of being Muslim. And that itself has no basis, and if you make it a religious directive, the consequences are quite severe, and we see that in the world around us. And that you may try to cover it up by calling it a minor directive, or like it's there, but you don't need all that. But in fact, it's very difficult to hide from that. Very difficult to hide from the consequences of making that claim, let alone the fact that it has no basis in the religious sources of Islam. In the next session, we're going to get into the fourth point and then move through the remaining points, there are 10 total, in an effort to fully capture the critique that Javed Ghamidi is putting forward of this relationship between religion and state, and what he fundamentally sees as a misunderstanding of what Islam itself is saying about these matters. I look forward to continuing this conversation. Akhir ad-dawa walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.